I was a principal of a school in Johannesburg. My husband took early retirement and we moved to Plettenberg Bay in 1984. I was pretty bored because he was building a house and we were living in a caravan. And so I started working part-time in the local municipal library. And one day in the post there was a brochure from an organization called READ. Now READ was an organization that was set up to source books, library books, for schools from previously disadvantaged communities at a very low cost. So being a teacher, I made a suggestion this was a really good thing we could do, and so we collected money in the library and we bought 1,000 rands worth of READ books. Then when the little parcel came, we opened it and took out a couple and went down into Bossieshof to meet with the principal and staff. The principal of the town was a Miss Brickwa. We'd never met her before, we'd never been to the school. We knocked on the door and we said, we've collected money for some library books like this. We'd like to meet with you, and we made an arrangement to pick the staff up and to go to tea in the afternoon at the librarian's house. Now there were 4 teachers in the school and there were 260 children. We picked them up and took them for tea. We gave them the library books. They weren't very enthusiastic. And then we said, we'd like to help you. What do you need? And they said, we need brooms. Brooms. We had decided what the school needed. And that was a very good lesson of the difference between perceived needs and real needs. So I started helping in the local primary school from time to time, invigilating exams and filling in forms and giving support. And then in 1991, the Inspector of Basic Education, Mr. Jasi, at a prize-giving function announced that a Standard 8, Grade 10 class would be established, as the little school only went up to Standard 7 up to Standard 7. So desks and textbooks arrived for the children, and they sat, and they sat, and they sat for a whole term with no teacher. Eventually, the new principal, Mr. Faku, and the inspector of ABET, Adult Basic Education and Training, asked if I would start adult education and basic education training for the children. And so in the April of 1992, I moved in, sourced teachers, and started with 43 learners. Now we had 2 classrooms, and under ABET, you only needed 20 learners per group. So I split them into 2, a group of 21 and a group of 22, and we ran 2 streams. We were allowed 6 subjects of 3 hours a week. Now that made 18 hours, but we were sort of attached to the primary school, and their week was 25 hours, and we had to fill in 7 hours. I sourced second-hand typewriters from Rotary, and we established a typing class. The department allocated 1 hour paid per week per group for typing. But we still had 6 hours to fill in, so we brought in volunteers who did an hour of art. The rest of us filled in unpaid time, doubled up, and we filled the timetable. That was unpaid. In 1993, at the end of that, at the beginning of the next year, we started with 98 learners. Now we had Standard 8 and 9 and 2 classrooms. We had no desks, no textbooks, and no writing materials for the Standard 9 grade 11s. A grade 7 class at Herschel in Cape Town, little children, it's a private school, raised funds, the children, for writing materials and additional readers, so that we then had writing materials for the children. I discovered a friend of mine was the mayoress of Sheffield. She held a function which raised £500, made 5,000, and we bought essential textbooks for the grade 11s. But we needed furniture. We had no desks. We had the children and no desks. I went to Plettenberg Bay, a local school, and they had 44 desks waiting to be picked up. They'd been condemned as they were unusable, and they gave them to us. The municipality gave me a truck, and we transported 44 rocking and rolling desks from Plettenberg down into Bossieskloof. We had desks. But coming up in 1994 would be our first matric class. We only had 2 classrooms and the part-time use of a third. Now, the old primary school was based in town, where Arrowwood stands today, and they were moving to their new premises at the end of 1993. It was a beautiful premises. There were prefabs, there was a structure, there were offices, there were rooms for library, there were ablution facilities. And so I applied to the Cape Education Department for the use of those buildings. The head of ABET, Adult Basic Education and Training, Mr. Anton Gunter, came to my farm to tell me that we had that property. Before I could even tell anybody, good old South African politics reared its head. F.W. de Klerk had a friend in the street, and he didn't want little black children running in his street. They sold it immediately to Group 5 for development. But Group 5 gave me 9 old prefabs. Now, I could not touch those prefabs before school closed on the 8th of December. And the builders went on holiday on the 12th of December, and I needed classrooms for the beginning for January. I had no money. I managed to raise money through Utuba. And Ronald Derbyshire agreed to move the classrooms from after the school closed. They cut them in half, loaded them onto low-bed trailers, and I followed my classrooms down Marine Drive to the new site. But now the next problem was the site. We had no land on which to put them. I sourced land in the industrial area from a Mr. Chris Minnow, who very kindly let me. It was an industrial site adjoining Bossieskloof, and he allowed me to put my prefabs on his land. And so, before the end of the year, 7 prefabs were moved and re-erected in the industrial area. We had classrooms. There were 2 remaining in bad condition. After many months of negotiation with Group 5, I persuaded them to pay me out for the classrooms that were too dilapidated, and they paid me out 11,000 rand. Now we had classrooms, we had desks for standard 8 and 9, but nothing for matrics. And then the most amazing thing happened. There was a little town in Germany where a pastor had, there was a pastor of the Lutheran Church, Pastor Janssen, and he had a brother who lived in Plet. And early on, when Mrs. Harker, who was a social worker in New Horizons, had wanted to establish a safe house, his brother Tito Janssen in Plet had managed to source funds from the Lutheran Church in Germany. And that little community then established the safe house in Plet. But living in that little village was a blacksmith, and he'd made a lot of money, and he died and left his wife very, very wealthy. but they had no children. And she was a member of this church. And she went to Pastor Janssen and said she'd like to do something in Africa. So Tito came to me and said, he told me the story. He said, could you use some money? I said, oh boy, could I use some money? She sent us 20,000 Deutsche Marks, 30,000 Rand. We bought desks, office furniture, overhead projectors, photostat machines, a telephone. We had a school, and the school was established. Now, staffing was always a problem. There was a similar situation in Robertson of a learning centre like ours. We were called the Plettenberg Bay Learning Centre. So together with Robertson, we applied to the Minister of National Education, I think he was Ben Murray at the time, for one permanent post, textbooks and writing materials. That was given to us, and Mr. Pinder Hinser was appointed to that permanent staff. During the course of that 1994, Mr. Galaba joined our staff as a part-time teacher. Mr. Galaba stayed with the school and has just retired from teaching this year from Murray High School. There were other members of staff. They came from all communities. We were a multiracial staff. Those that talked the longest, Mrs. Donald, Mrs. Faree, Miss Gub, Miss Chembezi, Miss Schwellness, Mr. Namtu, Mr. Pambani, Mr. Plunger, Jonas, Peterson, Stokes, Smith, McLaughlin and Becky. And we were paid 25 Rand an hour. If you were teaching a subject for 3 hours a week, you earned the grand sum of 150 Rand a week. I calculated my salary averaged out at 1,000 Rand a month. But each year the amount increased. If I remember correctly, it was 56 Rand was when we finally all the staff became full-time. Now we ran two streams. The one stream, all the learners did Xhosa first language and English and Afrikaans as second languages. Then the one stream did maths, biology and science. The science originally had been agricultural studies, and we canned them for science. The other stream was history, geography and biblical studies. The Bib studies also was agriculture, and we got rid of that for biblical studies. But we had no science equipment. We had to source equipment. So I approached SA Breweries, and they gave me 25,000 Rand for equipment. So we opened in 1994 with 269 learners, 1 full-time post, and 7 classrooms with desks. Because we were ABET, we could take adults. And the learners came from all over. There was a husband and wife couple who worked at the BI who came and finished their matric with us. They would come to school in school uniform in the morning, change in the toilets, catch the BI bus, go to work in the afternoons, go home late, sort out the children and study at night by candlelight. They did very, very well. In 1994, we wrote our first matric. Now, Mr. Jasi had thought we were pretty much a Mickey Mouse setup. You can imagine these teachers coming and going, no funds from the department, everything was private. Our results were very satisfying. We got a 63% pass rate. We had 13% university exemption. We were 3rd in the district. We beat Mossel Bay and Oudtshoorn, established high schools. We were 10th in the Western Cape. All our hard work and struggles had borne fruit. Now, the DET announced in 1995 that we were to be a combined school. The primary school were moving to Kwanakatula to their new building, so grades 8 and 9 joined us, standard 6 and 7. We now had 500 learners. We used a couple of the old primary school classrooms, but of course the primary school took all their furniture, so there were no desks. The children were sitting on the floor. So I borrowed trestle tables and chairs from the municipality, and then eventually the DET sent us furniture. But we couldn't carry on like that. We needed buildings. An area in Konakatula was zoned as a high school, but I had to find money to build a high school. I contacted the IDT. I found the CEO of the IDT had been in New Sass in the early days, and I had been in New Sass. His name was Jolyon Nuttall. I knew him. I put in an application for funding to build buildings. He sent a lady called Nopli Katelo to investigate, and after many discussions, the IDT agreed to sponsor a school, and they gave us 1.6 million to do the initial buildings. But the money they controlled. They started building in 1994, but there were problems before they could start. The area was in phase 3, and phase 3 had no infrastructure. So the municipality objected. The white community objected because they said that the people would never move from Bosika to Konakatula. In fact, there was an article in the Sunday Times citing that their refusal to move, but they were protesting for houses. Eventually, we overcame all the obstacles, and the IDT built us 9 basic classrooms, a science lab, a library, ablution facilities, and an admin block. We moved in April 1995 into our new buildings. We were still a comprehensive school. I can't remember the date when the school was declared officially a high school. Mr. Hinsa became the first principal. Now, the naming of the school was also of interest. At a general AGM of the parent and learners and teachers, the children stood up and announced that the name of the school would be Murray High. It was a deeply moving moment, and I was most honoured. Today, there are 1,448 learners. There are 45 members of staff. That includes teaching staff, ground staff, and security. There is a fully equipped library, science lab, and of course many additional classrooms. This is the story of a community driven by a need for the provision of education, harnessing the energy, talents, resources of people not only from Plet, but from all over the world to achieve their vision. It is the story of young people of all ages, from teenagers to adults over 40 years, who grasped the opportunity of an education in order to achieve their dreams. Some of them attended school in the morning, drove fish trucks, made beds, waited tables after school, studied at night by candlelight. Many lives were changed. It was a momentous achievement, and for those of us involved, it was indeed an honor and privilege.